I want to thank our top sponsors, Børge Mo, Mathias Proy, Fergus Ryan, and Diego, for making this show possible. And welcome to the Cave of Apelles. Tonight's guest is a successful Swedish classical architect. He has a humanistic approach to his work. Humans are beautiful, he argues, and thus should architecture be beautiful too. However, he argues that it is important for new classical architecture to be truly classical in order to not be simply pastiche. After all, architecture mirrors the civilization itself. Nils Freckeus, welcome to the Cave of Apelles.
Thank you very much, Carl.
It's a really pleasure to have you here. Your work within architecture, as we can see some examples of here that we will definitely get into, are really inspirational and so varied. It's a really impressive, it's an impressive amount of work that you have done within a pretty short amount of time. One question I wanted to start out with is, I find it fascinating to know how an architecture student get into the classical field. So when you studied architecture, how did you end up getting into the classical architecture?
Well, that was actually the plan from the get-go. I have always been interested in the classical arts, especially architecture. I guess I'll have to thank my parents for taking me across Europe and showing me Venice and all of the beautiful places of Europe. So that was my inspiration.
And how did that work at the architecture school?
Well, it didn't work at all. So I tried to, sneak up upon my tutors to start with, and I felt maybe if I do a good job to begin with, maybe I can relieve my ambitions later on. And it didn't really work out. But the first project I did, I made it in typical modernistic fashion, I guess. And they actually liked it a lot, and there was this scribe who wrote down everything that the tutor said, and I found that piece of paper a couple of years ago, and actually I was actually a bit impressed about myself, and that I had some positive feedback once, at least during architecture school. So I immediately after that felt, well, now I can do some other things. And from the start, it didn't really work out. They started to question me, and they said, "Why are you using columns? Why?" And I was, I didn't really know how to handle it back then, because I felt it was self-evident. Why have anyone ever used columns, and why shouldn't I be allowed to do it? I mean, it's part of an eternal art form. Which I was hoping to learn at this school, but I took the initiative myself for it, and well, it was questioned from the start. So then I had to compromise. It's not purely classical. I introduced some modern elements into my thinking and into the designs I make, and I realized soon that actually made it even more easy to question what I did. It's not, it was a half measure of things always. It wasn't the pure form of architecture that I might have done if I had, realized from the start that I should do classical architecture, and this is my ambition. It was, always shrouded in something else within a compromise. So I would have done it differently if I started over. but I have to take things from where I am right now. So,
just for those listeners who are not that much into architecture as a field, would you maybe elaborate on what the professor or the schools wanted you to do and what you self wanted to do? Like this, it's basically a question of how to define the classical versus the modernistic. Like,
well, you know, they didn't want me to do anything. Actually, they said, here, go to the library, read some books if you like, but the main point is that you are going to invent your own tools and create your own expressions, so to speak, to become an artist. Okay. So it's a school of self-teaching, so to speak. And my immediate response to that was, so you have nothing to teach me? What's up with this? And that's the whole point. So no course literature at all, no exams, and you know, project-based form of education. Now you're getting me to start complaining again. I don't like complaining. I thought I'd stop doing that, but here we go. You need to get it out, I suppose.
yeah, it's good. But
I'm trying to think positive.
Yeah, that's a very good. Why is it important to think positive within architecture? Well,
you know, when I started my firm, I knew that this is going to be a struggle, and struggles are always hard to get through. You know, and that's the point. You learn some things and you get hardened by the struggle in itself, and you learn to get by, and then eventually maybe you get rewarded somehow, and that's the goal of it.
I think it's especially within architecture, but in culture in general today, that is so much colored by modernism and relativism. I think it's easy to fall into the complaining trap. That because you want something else, it's easy to complain, and that's a big question. I think how to approach it. I recently talked to someone about the architecture uprising that is taking place in Sweden and Norway, and they are slowly starting to change things. And there was this interview with one architect who was influenced by the architecture uprising. She had started doing more classical style, and then this one person said, yes, but that's just one. Look at all these other things that are happening that are really terrible, just building boxes. And I definitely see that point, that there is not that much positive to, or compared to the negative things that are happening, maybe the positive is very small. But then again, if you're just focusing on the negative, it just gives it more and more attention.
Well, I think the thing about complaining is that you're putting blame on everyone else than yourself. You should look within yourself. What can I do to make things better? And then what are my circumstances and how can I use them to evolve from those muddy territories of when everything is not going your way. And that has also become my niche. I am one of the few classical architects in Sweden. And that has not led at this point to that people or potential clients call me because they know me, not at this point. And I go for the big clients, the developers, and not private customers. And so I approach them and enter competitions. And then if you win, you become the big developer's architect, and that's the way. That's my, so to speak, mission or vision, or how my plan for coming through.
And talking about competitions, we can go over to this wonderful these wonderful buildings here that was part of a competition in 2020 and 2021, where your submission ended up in first place, right?
Yeah.
Could you tell us the story about what this competition was and what the latest news are about it?
Well, this is a city block, which is supposed to be one of the initially 3 classical residential blocks in Upplands Väsby, which is a town outside of Stockholm. And the mayor of this town, Oscar Weinmar, he's my hero, because he had the stamina and sense of innovation to do something that all other municipalities didn't do back then. So he initiated this competition as a new type of form of competition. Usually municipalities, they use this law we have in Sweden, which could be translated as the law of municipal acquisitions. And that basically means that when the municipalities when they buy something, they have to look to which alternative is the cheapest one. And it speaks for itself that doesn't lead to quality. And it's the same way when it comes to letting a developer buy land in the commune. Then they must take the highest bidder, the one who offers the highest price for the land. And when they start the bidding process, it's an anonymous one. So one bidder are not allowed to know what the other bidder is offering. So that leads to a guessing game. You have to guess what will the other ones bid. And that leads to that developers, they have to, bid as high as they possibly can. So even though the bidding competition is not open, they push the limits and they put as much money as they can into the price. So then if they win, there is no money left for putting into the architecture. So the result is then, of course, a crappy project because you have already wasted all of your money. So Oscar Weinmar, he was the mayor for Moderaterna in Sweden, so right-wing party. He said, well, if we don't let our developers bid and say, this is the price for the land, give us this price, and then you compete. So how will we compete then? Well, by making a proposal for which we find the best one. It's a competition. The jury was then supposed to judge which of these projects is the best one, not regarding to price. And then they made a internal referendum, the politicians, and they also let the inhabitants of Upplands Väsby vote for which project they found the best one. So I won in both those referendums, so I was then the winner. And I did this on my spare time because I had just stopped working for a startup in Stockholm, a company that was bought by Ilja Bataljan, if someone knows who it is, SBB, Samhällsbyggnadsbolaget, one of the They were actually the biggest real estate company in Sweden until the stock price went down in the ground. And I was out before then, luckily. So then this competition came and I entered it and I spent half a year doing it. And so I also had to find a developer to do it with, of course, and we won. So that was the start of my architectural firm.
That's a really fascinating and impressive story. And I'm just curious, was this a competition in like, did you compete with other classical propositions, or
yeah, absolutely. The premise was you have to do a classical proposal.
Yeah, because
that was the premise.
That's very very interesting. Why?
It's unusual. Well, that's all because of Oscar Weimar. I guess he had a personal interest in classical architecture, and he is also, of course, a politician. So he figured, how will I get the voters to put their vote on me? Well, maybe by building more beautiful environments, because that's in the end what people want: good environments to live in. So that's what he did, and that was actually before the election. So he put this proposal forward that I will make a competition for beautiful buildings. So he became the mayor, and then because of several reasons, after I won, the project has been delayed, so it's not built yet. We're still waiting for some factors to come in play, and then we will hopefully build it. The developer Sveafastigheter, they want to put the shovel in the ground as soon as possible.
Well, fingers crossed.
Yeah.
This was something that that also reached Norwegian news and ended up in one of Norway's largest newspapers and everything. It's so it's definitely unique that there was this classical competition, and so fingers crossed that it will be.
Well, for a long time you have been a bit more avant-garde in Norway within architecture. I mean, looking at the Oslo Opera House, it's proven now that such a project is impossible in Sweden. We tried to do the Nobel Center, and that was stopped due to public opinion. So even when we try, we fail, and you are a bit more bold when it comes to modern architecture. You and the Danes, and Sweden, we are more mellow yellow.
Yeah. So. I don't know if that's a good thing.
No, me neither. But for me, maybe it is, because people want something. I mean, people want something that is a symbol of their own time. And I mean, do you want to adapt to your own time in such a case? What is that? I'm of the opinion that you create your own time. What you do is your time. So, and it has always been like that. You shouldn't be a slave to the circumstances in the past. When you speak for modernist architecture today, you actually want the modernist architecture from old times back. That's what you want. It's not our time. Our time is what you make of it. That's my opinion, at least.
And there's one interesting thing that you have stated in an article about sticking to the classical principles. That when building new beautiful architecture, it's important to stick to these classical principles to avoid new buildings from becoming pastiche.
Well, to begin with, at least.
Yeah.
And this is what I learned at architecture school. If you try to compromise, it's easier to criticize you. And if you stick to the purely classical architecture, people will recognize it. And there is no way of complaining other than saying this does not belong to our time. That's the only argument left. And I think I can defeat that argument by saying it's the same thing as you did during the Renaissance. I mean, why did Brunelleschi start making columns? They were already 2,000 years old back then, and he did it again, and it became the biggest movement of Western culture. So I think we can do that all over again. It's another Renaissance. I mean,
yeah,
that's how history works. Things happen again.
But these classical principles, could you elaborate on what you mean by following the classical principles in opposition, or is it in opposition to being playful within architecture, or is that embedded into the classical principles as well?
Well, it's it's always easier being creative if you have some knowledge that you use. At architecture school, they said basically here you have a tabula rasa, a blank sheet of paper. So the students sat down with a pencil in their hand, and they thought, what am I going to draw here? My head is also blank, so nothing can come out. I mean, it's one thing being filled with knowledge, and you can put something on that paper, but if you're blank here, it doesn't work. You have to have knowledge in order to be creative. That's the point. And in classical architecture, you have the rule book, and you can bend it a little bit how you want, but it gives you a sense of creativity. I know how to do these things, and that leads to another thing, and then at one point you start getting innovative, even inventing new things. But I don't think that you are mature enough to do that when you haven't read the whole book.
Yeah, and what I'm thinking when I read your article is how this knowledge of the classical field that is very much about other things than the cliché classical aspects, such as columns and a style being more the classicist kind of style, but more about proportion and measures against each other, and how it fits to other kind of styles.
Yeah, well, I have to easily try to contradict you in this sense about the columns, because everything actually starts with the columns. It starts by getting to know what you call the different moldings, different profiles that the column consists of. As my classical tutor told me, everything begins with the word. You have to know what you are speaking of. Otherwise, you can't. You don't know what you're doing and why, and you can't tell anyone else what you are doing. So the lack of knowledge is inevitable. So you start by learning what are things called, and then you start to make drawings of the columns, and then comes the teachings of proportions. The proportions are hidden within the columns. You can start by basically making a temple, several floors, and then you remove the columns, and then you have the proportions. That's how it works. So, and then when you get, skilled, you don't even have to start by making the columns. You know what the proportions are about. So you get this sense of it by having the knowledge from the start. That's the point. In Sweden it's called proportionslära. It means the teachings of proportions, and nobody knows what it is. But it is the columns. That's what it is. Yeah.
Well, my point was something I remember Calder-Loth, an architecture historian based in New York. He had this course on classical architecture, like an introduction course, and he showed the difference between a column with wrong proportions, way too thin and way too high, and a column in right proportions, and that it's difficult to explain without seeing it. But when seeing it, it's at least to my eye, it's so obvious that the one column with wrong proportions that was way too thin and way too high was like, it's just not right. And Yeah,
Well,
that was basically my point, that it's not just to put up several columns and then it's like, well, it's at least more classical.
Well, it has to be a correct column, of course.
Yeah.
But I mean, you're right. You can differ a correct column from a faulty column, but that's partly because you have seen the correct column before, so you recognize it. But then there's the other part, and that's that the column reflects the human being, actually. And that's where the proportions for the column comes. And then the column constitutes the proportions of the building. You don't necessarily need to see a person in the building. That's I mean, that's only a problem for me when I put windows on the building and I see a human face, which is not always a good looking face. So you want to remove that face. It's a common problem. But you know, the column is it has its shaft and its capital, and then the entablature on top, and the entablature is 1/5 of the whole thing, exactly as you have 1/5 from your shoulder to the top of your head. So you have the human being there, and the capital is the proportion of the human face on the body. So that's where it comes from.
Yeah, and that's what Vitruvius writes, that beauty is the eternal shapes found in nature. And I think that's a very, it's the closest I've come to a good definition of beauty. It's often very up there, but he links it very directly to nature.
Yeah, well, I think beauty is what you recognize the most. I once saw this clip of a criminologist back in the 1800s, and he had a task, and that was to create the general face of a criminal person. How does a criminal person look, so we can recognize them on the street? That's a criminal person. So he took then pictures of people in prison, and he morphed all of the pictures together. And he figured, oh, this will be the face of the most ugly-looking human being that has ever been seen. But it wasn't. It was actually maybe the most beautiful picture of a face that you had ever seen, because it was, you know, an average face. It had a little bit of that and a little bit of that, and everything was evened out. So that was the ideal face, the most beautiful face, the most average face, most recognizable face, most typical for a human face, and that's a beautiful face.
That's very fascinating.
Yes.
I never heard about that before.
I just made it up. Yeah. No, it's true. It's true.
Yeah. It's a good point anyway.
Maybe that's why you think you have a daughter.
Yeah.
And she is a combination between your wife and you, so you find her beautiful.
Yes. Actually, the most beautiful.
Most is. Yeah, I believe you.
According to me.
Yeah, I haven't seen your wife, but I guess she's a nice wife. Yeah.
So when you mentioned the Nobel Center in Stockholm, and this is a drawing that you have made of the Nobel Center, isn't that right? Of a suggestion for.
Well, I can actually absolutely not take full credit for this rendering.
Okay.
Partly because I based it on a picture made by Ferdinand Boberg. But the design of the building is mine, but the design is in its totality based on a design concept invented by Ferdinand Boberg. But you know, in his turn, he was inspired by a temple in India. So I mean, it's an eternal chain of stealings, you know. But he actually made two proposals for a Nobel house in Stockholm. In the end of the Strandvägen, that's the grandest boulevard in Stockholm, and it faces in the east nothing. It's only a hill with trees on it, and this was the place for the Nobel house. So the Alfred Nobel will stated that we will build a Nobel house to house the ceremony and to give the prize and so on. And that has not happened yet. And in the general plan, the master plan of this site in Stockholm, there was actually the footprint of this building for 100 years. And when the geniuses of the Nobel Foundation came up with we're not going to do this building, but another one on Blasieholmen, which is close by. They removed that plan, that old plan. So, and now we have nothing because the new Nobel Center, which they were about to build, never became realized. So now we're back at zero. And
that building was this square.
The box. Yes, the golden box.
Golden box, yeah.
Which was stopped by a man called Björn Taras Wahlberg. He drove the campaign against the city and eventually got the politicians to vote down the new proposal. Because once again, they understand that the public doesn't want us to do it, so we shouldn't do it. So that was clever. Yeah. But if you compare, for instance, this competition to the Nobel Center competition, they are contraries of each other. This was an open competition. Everyone could join, and everyone will know who is making the proposal. In the Nobel Center competition, they invited a certain small group of already established architects. And they had a small jury that elected the winner, and the public had nothing to say about it. So, and then in the end it was voted down, so because the public didn't want to have it. So maybe the next time they'll do it in another way, but I think they will skip the competition. Instead. They will not have a competition. So, and that's what they're doing. They're trying to build the Nobel Center on Södermalm instead in Stockholm. So they will keep it, under its cover, plan it secretly, and then they will just build it without any insight of the public. So that's the smartest way.
That reminds me of how the Norwegian government did it with the new National Museum.
Yeah.
They had this beautiful National Gallery in Oslo, which was it was a small gallery, but it was very beautiful. And they decided to build a new one. And when the public, and the new one is of course this enormous box, black and terrible. And when the public started to react and be like, "Oh, we don't want that. We want the art to stay in the gallery," then the ministers of culture said that, "Well, it's impossible to go back. It's already decided on. Yeah. We cannot go back. We have started this," and that happened very quickly. And then they found out maybe a year later or something that it wasn't actually settled at that time. 1 year ago, when they told the news and told everyone that this is settled, there's no way back, that was not the truth.
No.
They just pushed it forward and was like, this is going to happen, there's no way back, we cannot listen to the public, it has to be like this.
Yeah, well, I don't know about governance in Norway, but it sounds like a lie. In Sweden, the politicians can decide whatever they want. I mean, look at buildings that has a K-märkning, what do you say, a protection for inheritance and such. I mean, those buildings, you're not supposed to demolish them. But if a politician signs the document, they can do it. So it's only a decision away, always. You can always remake your decisions, absolutely. That's what they did in the Nobel Center case.
So this, to go back to your proposal for the Nobel Center, I find the style very fascinating. As you mentioned, inspiration from Indian temples, and it looks like some Art Deco too. And it's the opposite of, or not the opposite, but it shows a very, I would say, a creative way of using classical architecture?
Yeah, I'm not even sure if it is classical architecture. It has some sort of columns, but I had to invent them myself because I didn't really have the books back then. But I anyone can go out on the streets and look for columns on buildings. So, but I thought maybe I do some Jugend Art Nouveau looking columns, and but that's only the columns, and the rest is the middle part I was inspired to by visiting Milan, actually. So the old Lombardian churches in Milan has this octagonal shape with the tri-four windows, windows with two columns in the middle. So that's a concept from Lombardy, actually, but on the whole it really looks like his two old proposals. So, and when this was my graduation project, so I spent half a year, so it's completely drawn through. It's a fully developed project, so yeah. And when I had my presentation of it in the end, one of my you always have 3 critique persons which gives you a hard time, and one of them said in the end, "What do you mean this building is not an existing one?" No, there's no such building. Aha, all right, okay, thank you. So he thought that this building was actually an existing building in Stockholm.
Okay.
And so he spent 10 minutes giving me a hard time. He didn't know anything about it at all. He didn't even know the premise, why I had done it, and so he didn't know anything. And I tried to explain it, but it didn't go through because he had his vision of it, his truth to it. Well, so that's it. And then I got my graduation, and then the headmaster shook my hand and said, "Congratulations, you're now an architect." I'm an architect. I haven't even done anything yet. How can you have the gall to call me an architect? You haven't taught me anything, and I haven't done anything. So I'm not an architect. Give me a couple of years, and maybe I will call myself an architect, and then you can do it also. Yeah.
Yeah. It's what do you think about the name classical when it comes to classical architecture? The reason I ask is that I've personally experienced architects, modernist architects, that seem to think that classical means classicist, and this is not a classicist style. And so, what do you think of using the name classical?
Well, there is a broader term, traditional architecture. Everything goes into traditional architecture, even this, I suppose. But classical architecture has become a buzzword that everyone uses in order to gain popularity. But they don't know what it is. So you should start by defining it, and it's quite easy. It's the type of architecture that is derived from ancient architecture. And by ancient, I mean the period 400 years before Christ, and then during the antique period, the Greek antique period and the Roman Empire. That's classical architecture, and it's based on columns. And the book of rules the set of rules that you have, that's classical architecture. And when you try to do classical architecture all over again, you have classicism. And then when you do it one more time, it's neoclassicism. So it's trying to do it again is one type of classicism, but the proposals you've seen, they don't connect to the classical canon. The canon is the way of doing it correctly. And since the architects, they don't have any knowledge of it of any kind, I have a hard time seeing that they would learn in a couple of months doing a proposal. So they shouldn't call what they do classical, of course. And the premise shouldn't even be classical architecture, because not so many architects master classical architecture. The politicians should say traditional architecture. But then you wonder, what is that? So it's a confusion of words, and that's why I told you should start with the word always. What am I doing? What am I doing, and why, and how?
Yeah. So then, So you think that there is what you described as classical is basically then classicist, you would argue, or?
Well, I can never do, if I would be honest, classical architecture, because all of the classical buildings, they have already been built, and they were built 2,000 years ago. So whenever I do anything reminiscent of classical architecture, it's classicism, actually.
Okay.
Yeah. And then it's a question of how strictly do you connect to the canon. I mean, if you stray far, it's not classicism anymore, because then you have become innovative and you do something new based on classical architecture. But well, you don't have to be so proper about it. I have no problem calling it classical architecture, but it's not correct. But but we can do it for to make it more simple. Yeah.
And how? Although I see the point of not getting too much into the words, but it's also important, because it's often a criticism from modernists that, oh, you say classical.
Yeah.
What do you mean then by classical? But then you said it's more correctly to call it traditional. But a possible criticism towards the term traditional, it's that it can be too broad.
Yeah, well, this is, as you said, more like an Indian temple or something. That's also traditional.
Yeah.
But first of all, another architect should never ask me what you mean by classical, because he should know himself, because he's an architect. So it shouldn't even be a question. If a politician wants classical architecture, the architects should know what it is and do it. But in this case, they started to complain, and they said, in a competition, you shouldn't be forced to use one of 3 styles or whatever it was. And there was one architecture, it was actually my old boss who said this. He said that having to choose between some styles in a competition is like saying to a journalist, you can only use 800 words when you write this article. And I mean, yes, tough luck, Mr. Journalist, but hey, if you're a poet, and I say, I want you to write me a poem, but you must use rhyme for it. Is that an obstacle for you, or is it something that maybe pushes you to excel in some way? You should always have rules. I mean, it's not fun playing tennis without a net. No. So making these criterias, why should that be bad? I mean, he was probably not happy with the premise of classical architecture. That's the problem. Oh. Yeah.
And often, I'm not sure if that's the case in Sweden, but in many countries, the current situation is that the law that, or the bureaucracy, or the laws that regulate the construction are, although it's not stated particularly, it still really favors modernistic architecture. Like for instance, in Norway, there is this. There has been this law, but now it has changed, or is about to change. But when you are adding something to an existing building, that is an old building, it could be from the 1800s or 1700s, the addition should reflect the time it was built in. And of course, it's possible to have your approach to the zeitgeist as that we create our own time, which I definitely support. But in practice in Norway, that has been that the addition should stand out as something shockingly modernist, like some glass construction on wooden 1700 building.
And now they have put a halt for that, you say?
Now,
by this new...
Yes, now that part of government that regulates that has changed it, but I haven't seen it so much in practice. But it has been changed, and...
Well, I find that being quite a desperate move to protect the old buildings, and of course you should do that. But with that sense, you would never have, for instance, the Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris, because that was built largely in the 1800s. And then they said, let's make the additions as 1800 Gothic forms of Gothic architecture. So they had their own approach to it. And then when the cathedral burnt a couple of years ago, they said, oh, Jesus Christ, we have to do it exactly as it was before. And this mentality, they wouldn't have had that, in the 1800s. And even in the 1400s or whenever, they would have made it something of their time. They would have rebuilt it differently. It's very common to see a cathedral that has two different types of towers, because they did them in different periods. Sometimes one, like I think it was a Chartres cathedral, one of the towers burned to the ground, and they made it even higher and even more beautiful than it was before, but it was the architecture of a new century. And if the Notre Dame Cathedral would have burnt down during the 1800s, they would have made it bigger and better. But now we're going to do it the same. And it's so boring, but it's good, because I wouldn't dare letting the modernists get their take on it and do it completely different. That would have been devastating.
Yeah, because I can see that point in an ideal world to build something even more fantastic that has some kind of notion of the time that we live in. But as you said, with Notre Dame, it would be probably a glass roof and some kind of shocking colors.
It would not have been classical. And one of the main points of modernism is tear up society and make it all over again.
Yeah.
So why would they even start making an addition or a rebuild of Notre Dame? A point of modernism would have been demolish it completely and do something else. And of course, for starters, not the church, because we do not believe in God and churches as modernists. And we don't believe in people that believe in religion, so they shouldn't go there.
No. That was something. The new art museum in Norway that I mentioned is built in typical Bauhaus style, and I remember someone I know pointed out that it's insane to build it in Bauhaus style, the National Museum, because
German style.
Because he was against any nations or any monarchies or any. But back to your back to the point of Notre Dame and reflecting one's own time. What I think, I personally, when I say classical, I think of more traditional architecture. I use it as a broader term, and I would say, although that has been the case in, as you said, in the 1400s, the 1500s, they are rebuilding something and they want it to be the style that is in fashion at that time. But that's more fashion within architecture or development, or call it whatever. But then I think the big difference between modernism is that it actually has that goal of breaking with tradition, of not following it. So when you see other styles, whether it is Baroque or neoclassicism or Jugend, they still have a goal of respecting the previous traditions and follow the...
Yeah, well, the framework is still classical architecture.
Yeah.
And you can do whatever you want within that framework. So it's respectful in that sense. But, you had this guy called Corbusier, the great modernist god-like creature. And you know, when he set out to build his career and fame, he said, I have invented a new type of architecture now, and we're going to call it modernism. And it consists of these 5 rules, you know, put the house on pillars and make the roof flat and have a free plan, put the windows wherever you want, and make the ground floor a pissoir for homeless people. No, but I don't know. But I don't remember the last one. But you have this set of rules, 5 rules. And he said, this is what we are going to do from now on. You don't have to invent anything else because I've already done it. This is what we are going to do. And that was very radical of him. He was, you know, a rebel in architecture. So he became this idol of new, young, modernist architecture. And they wanted to be like him, like he was. So they also wanted to be radical. The only problem was that what were they going to invent? Because he had already invented everything and he had forbidden everything else. So they couldn't repeat what he did. And this is the great paradox within modernism. There is nothing else to do because it was stated in its cradle. This is what we are going to do. And I mean, something that is fixed in time naturally becomes old. So the modernists, they are actually the ones that strive towards the past. And I'd like to hold myself as one that wants to evolve the architecture. But as you said, it's a good idea starting with getting to know what am I doing and to do it correctly. Right at the beginning. And then after a while, you might start to evolve. If people get used to what you're doing and if they let you do it.
I want to continue a bit on the Notre Dame track because that's such a concrete example. And do you have any other hesitations towards reconstructing exactly as it was, except for it being not ideal, in the sense that if today's architecture environment was not stuck in the modernism, it would actually be possible to create something that was even better and more magnificent?
Well, you know, I'm an egoist just like Corbusier. Yeah. I'm also vain.
Yeah.
You know, and when I walk the streets and I look at beautiful buildings, there are always things that I feel that I would have made differently. But you know, I'm against removing things that has worked for a long time and that are beautiful. So if the royal castle of Sweden would have burnt to the ground, I would have, if I was appointed to remake it, I would have done it almost exactly, but changed maybe some minor things. But still being respectful of the original, I guess.
Yeah.
So,
this
building, it wasn't built yet. So,
not yet.
And they didn't like it. That's why they didn't build it. So I changed it quite a lot. Yeah.
But do you see any moral? Are there any moral problems with building copies?
Well, everything. I mean, you are a copy of your parents. So everything is a copy of something, and in the mix, I mean, something happens. You didn't become exactly the same as your parents. I mean, you're not. You and your father are not twins. And the same thing happens with architecture. You start by copying, and then you do something else. Because the knowledge in the classical architecture, it gives power to the creativity. That's how it works. You always add something, and that's a natural instinct for an architect that maybe is about to make another version of the Notre Dame. So, but if you tell the conservative restoration architects, if you give them the job, they will remake it as it was, of course. And I mean, at this point of time, I don't see any problems with that, since I'm afraid it wouldn't have been any better if they would have tried to make it better at this point. Maybe there is someone out there able to do it, but it was quite good as it was. But I've never liked the towers, though. I think the windows are too close together. So I would have changed that. But overall, it was quite a magnificent building, great building. Yes, of course.
The reason I'm asking is that I do believe that one of the central problems within architecture today, or within the philosophy of architecture, is the Western moral difficulties with copy. And I believe that is quite different in many Eastern in many Eastern ways of thinking. For instance, in China, they have two words for copy. One that means a poorer copy, which is basically what we think of as the notion of copy in Western society today. And then there is the word copy, which means equally good. And I heard of this person who came to one site in China, and they pointed to this building and said, "This is from the year 700." Like, wow, this wooden building is from 700. That's amazing, but really, has it lasted for this long? And yes, it's from the 700. And as more as the person started digging, he found out that, well, if you want to be very particular about it, it burnt down 20 times and it was reconstructed every time. But they consider it the same building. And
because it was a good copy.
Yeah, because it was this second version of the word copy, or the sense of copy. So, for instance, in a different Eastern country, at the island Okinawa in Japan, the Shuri temple burnt down in 2019, and before the ashes were cold, like the day after, just hours after it had burnt down, the minister responsible for that said it will be reconstructed. Like no question, like in Paris with Notre Dame, like how should it be constructed? Something new element. It was like, it will be constructed. We'll start as soon as possible. It will be exactly how it was. And I don't remember when the Shuri's temple is from, 1200s or something, I think. And looking into its history, it has burnt down several times.
Well, I guess they made a perfect building from the start.
Yeah.
And they were happy with it.
Yeah.
You know, Western culture is more ad hoc. You try something out, maybe people like it, maybe they don't, something happens, some genius comes along and makes it differently. That's how we work, but not anymore. And I wonder why. And you know, the word copy, there is no actual notion of good or bad in it. But I mean, when you use the word pastiche, you take a word that actually means, I think it means copy, just some French dialect, I don't know. But you use it as, you apply it for bad copies. When you say that's a pastiche, you really mean it's a bad copy. But you could actually do a good pastiche. You can actually make a better pastiche than the original. So I guess we have different ways of thinking.
Yeah.
The big question is, why are we becoming more Eastern-like in that sense? I think you are more philosophically read than I am, so maybe you can explain it from an intellectual perspective.
Well,
I don't know.
No?
I actually don't know. I think it has it has to do with confidence and trust. You know, trust in institutions are on a historically low today, and no one trusts the architects no longer. And I mean, the general confidence, the self-confidence of every individual is also at an all-time low. And why is that? Is that just a natural state of a process we have gone through in Western culture? I don't know. But I do know, I mean, we have had other civilizations on the planet, and some of them has vanished. And there has been a lot of speculation about the Roman Empire and how it happened and why it was destructed. And there are several answers, of course, and it took some 100 years of it. But I have this favorite historian, British historian called Kenneth Clark. And he said there are 3 main enemies of any civilization which will make the civilization go down and perish. And those enemies are, let me see now if I can remember, they are fear, boredom, and lack of confidence. So he meant this is what made the Roman Empire go down. If you have all of these 3 at the same time, you get the worst thing, the lack of meaning. That's where you go then. So, I mean, in the Roman Empire, they had the fear of the barbarians, the fear of war, and the fear of evil dictators, and fear of, whatever. Today we have our own fears. I mean, we have the fears of climate change, the end of the world. That's a great fear. We have the fear of terrorism. We also have the fear of war. The fear of war is, I mean, always eminent and at place. So that's about the fear. And I mean, the boredom. People are bored today. We scroll our iPhones. We don't know what to do. We go out on travels because we're so fed up with our boring lives. So the main purpose of being is vacation. I mean, so that's boredom. And I mean the lack of confidence. If they could build the Notre Dame church in the 12th century, why can't we make it today? Why can't we make it even better? Well, because we have no self-confidence anymore. We have proven ourselves quite worthless in architecture for such a long time that no one believes the architectures anymore. So that's why we don't get the big jobs. I mean, sometimes like the Oslo Opera. So the question is, are we satisfied? Are people satisfied? Maybe. I don't know. But I mean, that's not a church. That's not a place which people go on a pilgrimage to. Maybe architects do. But I mean, it doesn't gather different people within a belief system, with common values. People go there to visit the opera, to admire the architecture. That's what they do. But it's not the same thing as a church.
So with that background, where do you think this is all going? Like in what direction do you think it is going with the architecture or with civilization in general? Are you hopeful or pessimistic?
Well, if we begin with sticking to architecture, then I am actually quite confident that things will turn out great in the future. I mean, the last time politicians spoke of architecture at all was after the Second World War, and especially in the 60s, when they were about to reform the whole of society by using architecture. And now politicians have started to speak about architecture again. And as we concluded, the politicians make the decisions. So if they have understood that people want good architecture, the first step is to say, we're going to have good architecture now. And then you define it. And then someone design it. And hopefully I'll be a part of that. So I am hopeful, seeing all of these tendencies with the architectural uprising and the politicians. And I think it's also actually possible to construct buildings like this without extra costs. I mean, you will, on the contrary, you will earn more money as a developer when you build like this, because people will pay to live in that building. They will pay more. So yeah,
that's interesting. Do you have are there, because that's a very usual argument against building in a classical style, because it's supposed to be more expensive. But are there any examples of that it's actually has been a good investment for the constructor?
Well, the person to ask is really Albert Svensson, if you want to ask a Swedish architect, because he's the only one that has actually got a classical building erected so far. You know about the Ekmansgatan, so that's the first one, I think, as a proper example of it. But then, you know, the cost is mostly due to materials, you know, and that's the only thing, the only weapon that the modernists have to flower their buildings with, so to speak. If you have a piece of land that is in the, I mean, on a central spot in the city, then you invest more because people will pay for it, and then you flower it with costly facade materials like costly brick, for instance. And we will have no brick here. This will be plaster and gypsum, and the stucco is plaster, and that's maybe the cheapest material there is. And you know, it's the same thing as 90%, I would say, of what you call the Stockholm stone city. You call it a stone city, but it's really made of gypsum and plaster. It looks like stone, but it's not, because gypsum is cheaper, and it's a good sustainable material to use. So I don't see why not. It's cheaper and it looks good. You just have to mold the forms and design it, and then you actually have the craftsmanship. It's there. We should use it. That
when you talked about sustainability of the materials, that reminded me of one building block in center city Oslo that was looked like a brutalist building from the 60s, but it had originally been a beautiful building from the late 1800s, 1890s, but then it was remade during the 60s and with concrete on the walls and everything. But then it was remade again, or they remade the facade again and made it not completely as it was in 1890, but made it more classical, with taking away the concrete and making some ornaments and making it back to looking like a pretty building that didn't that was not a disturbance to the eye, and a very good project. And the magazine I'm running, Civilization magazine, we interviewed the owners of that building, because that was like first time I had heard of in Norway. And the interesting aspect is that they had no notion of architecture at all. Their point was that this was a family-owned business, that building, and it had been for since it was constructed, and the family wanted it to be a good investment. And they knew that if we make it in a classical style with classical materials or traditional materials, then it will last longer, and the next generations will not have to like fix it for every 20th year or something. And that's an interesting aspect, I think, how this traditional classical style is more sustainable also in both materials but also in style. And that is a change that has, I think, been for the last decades, how there are usually these enormous big firms that own different building blocks instead of a family. It's a different kind of owner structure today that maybe doesn't or
it's a typical Pareto distribution, isn't it? That wealthy people gain more wealth and richer becomes richer, and buys up land. That's how it is.
Yeah, my point was that when something is family owned, it's easier to think about the next generations than if you are the CEO of a big firm, because then you're thinking
numbers
in a 10-year period.
Quantity.
You're thinking as long as you are sitting as a CEO, because the firm owns 100 buildings and you will soon not be the CEO, so you just want to have the profit for the next 10 years. And then you don't build something classical because you rather want to build something cheap and something that is fashion right now. And
I don't know how to solve that problem, but it hinges on another aspect, that is the sizes of the lots in the city, on the blocks. In the older days, they drew a plan and they said, here on this block we're going to have 20 different developers. So then you had this quite small lot and you had this money to invest, and then you wanted to do the building as functional as possible and as good looking as possible to compete with all of the other houses on the block. Today you hand one whole block to one developer. Maybe you give them 5 blocks and you say, here you go, make some money, and it's only numbers. So they want to if they're about to sell the apartments in the buildings, they just want to build it quick and sell it quickly and make their money and move on to the next project. That's how their business model works. So it was, and this is something you could easily not even regulate, but just decide we're not going to hand over whole blocks to the biggest companies. This is the mistake that the Social Democrats in Sweden made in the 60s. They financed the already biggest companies and made them even richer. And that's not a socialistic philosophy, is it? So they actually made the biggest companies even bigger and richer. And that's the problem we're stuck in today. Also, we only have some developers, 5 big developers we call them in Sweden, and we're starting to see a tendency of other actors coming into the ball plan, but it's a long process and you could easily regulate it, but I wouldn't use the word regulate. It's just making things right again. The problem is due to regulation, so you should unregulate it back. That's what you should do.
Could you elaborate a bit on that? Like, in what way are regulations?
Even though Oscar Weimar is my biggest idol, they were afraid of the capability of this being done. So they felt we have to give one block to one developer. Otherwise, the construction site, it will be chaos if we let 20 developers work on the same lot as in the old days. But we haven't done it for a while, so we're quite afraid of it. And then it was a question of the financial circumstances with a lot of unknown actors. It was a gamble you weren't willing to take upon yourself in this case. Instead, they focus on other important things. But it's easy for the politicians to tell the people working for the commune, develop this city, 20 developers per block. That's a rule, and see how it goes. The building sector would flourish, I think. You will get a lot of bad eggs in the beginning, but they will be, they will with time perish because they couldn't cut it. And then you will have some good new ones that would emerge from being small companies to becoming bigger and better. And then you have a lot of small, good building companies and developers. So I mean that's how I would do it.
To go from the very practical to the more general, on your firm's website, it says that human beings are beautiful and architecture should be so too. And that's a very optimistic and humanistic value system. Could you try to explain what's behind your value system when it comes to linking it to the beauty of human beings and why it's important for architecture to actually be beautiful?
I think people need beauty, because I mean the beauty has no purpose in itself except making people feel that they are worth something. And I mean when you look in the mirror, you wish that I wish I would see a beautiful person on the other side of the mirror when I look in it. But I mean when I look at myself in the mirror, I can at least give myself a smile. That's what I would like to see back when I look in the mirror. And when I look at the buildings, I would like to see that some architect, some group of people have put an effort in creating something that is for me to enjoy. You know, that effort, that love, that knowledge, that is reflected upon me. That's what I see. They did this for me. That's what I feel, even if I don't live in that building. So a sense of effort, that's it.
And it's also very, one can draw parallels between the architecture and also the other aspects of culture like literature and movies and paintings. It is valuable to, for instance, read a story that has a positive view on human beings. That doesn't need to be like something naive and just positive, but that there is some kind of, everything is not dark and gloomy and humans are terrible beings, but there are like some hope, and there is something with that strive towards making something that is pleasant and is rewarding to spend time among and to look at, that does something to you.
Well, you know, I realize in these times when you scroll your Instagram or whatever, and you see a lot of other people that are more beautiful than you are, that doesn't make you more happy. But I strongly believe in having ideals. I think that every person should and can strive for being themselves more beautiful, because you don't only do it for yourself, you do it for other people. So you put on a nice scarf or a jacket. You did that for me. You didn't do it for yourself. Well, in the long run, things that you do for others will reflect back on you. That's how it works. The more love you give, the more love will you get back. And I mean, it's the same things with buildings. Strive to make them more beautiful, and no one will feel envy of another building because it's not a human being. You might feel that, oh, those rich bastards living in that building, I'm so envious of them, but it's still your city. You're allowed to live in the city, and you can look at their good looking building and they see it only from the inside, but you see the building, and hey, you know, your building is also beautiful because all buildings that we build is beautiful. And you know, the most achievable building should be the newest one. I mean, say that it's a problem of wealth. I need money to buy this apartment in this good looking building. Which building do I want to live in? Yeah, well, I want to live on Strandvägen in Stockholm because there are the most beautiful and the biggest buildings. But if we always strive to build good, the best buildings will fall back over time, and the new buildings will be the best buildings. I mean, the richest people will say then, I'd like to live in a new building. That's where I would like to live, and it will cost the most. And then the 100-year-old building that was built for as the best one, that will be for all other people. So I mean, in the end, all of the buildings will be beautiful if you build only beautiful buildings, and you can put as much money as you can into it, because they will always be there. In the end, we will only have beautiful buildings. Am I expressing myself?
Oh yeah, it's
in a good way.
Very visionary and.
Yeah, what I'm trying to say is, I don't see a problem in building for the rich people, because in the end, all of the buildings will have been built for rich people, and everyone will live in a building built for a rich person. So maybe then I will live on Strandvägen, because the rich guys will live in the new buildings.
Yeah.
That's my philosophy. I mean, the cities, they are an eternal space where you can work. You can always make them larger. I mean, and not building those satellite cities that you did in the 60s. That's a bad idea, because then you enhance the segregation, of course, and the distances increases, and that's not a good thing, obviously. Why did they do that, the Social Democrats? Yeah.
You have mentioned that you approach any challenge, or you attempt to approach any challenge as the old masters.
I try to.
You attempt to. And who do you consider your main inspirations, or who do you consider the masters that you go to, and what have you learned from them, besides not building satellites as they did in the 60s?
Well, I'm inspired by, for instance, as I mentioned earlier, Brunelleschi. He tried to do something that anyone hadn't been doing for 1,000 years. And I mean, convincing people of this is the right way of doing it. Look, they did it before. These old buildings were not built by gods. They were built by human beings, and we can do it ourselves. And then as you start trying, you realize it is possible. And then it spreads. Everyone wants to do it because we have the capability in us. I think almost everyone can become a good architect. There is some literature for it. It's just a matter of wanting to do it. Get off your high horse and start doing proper classical architecture. It's not hard. I think that's what the world needs.
And on that note, Nils Freckeus, thank you so much for coming to the Cave of Apelles.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed being here.
It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you, the same.
And thank you for watching. Remember to head over to www.caveofapelles.com and become a member today. We'll see you next month.